Hello to all our listeners, to all our viewers from the city of the great King, Jerusalem. Welcome to Bridges for Peace's office. I'm Ilse Strauss. Now, in December 2024, the UK-based think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, published a report penned by Major Andrew Fox. The report, Questionable Counting, analyzing the death toll from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza, does exactly what the name says. It calls into question the mortality figures produced by the Gaza Ministry of Health, and then basically parroted in the media to become fact, and then used to accuse Israel of all kinds of evil, including genocide. You can look for the link to that report in the description below. I highly recommend reading it. Now, here today to discuss that report and its findings with us is the author himself, Major Fox. Andrew, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
No, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Before we get to the report itself, let's talk about you. What makes you a credible voice and a witness that carries authority on matters such as war in the Middle East?
So I served for 16 years in the British Army. I was an infantryman and I did some time working around special forces. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 as a platoon commander, and then 1 attached to the US Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. And then for the rest of my career, I served in Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and 1 trip to the Middle East. But whilst I was serving, I also did a master's degree focusing on strategy in the Middle East from 2003 to 2014. So that really gave me my interest in the Middle East. And I also studied for my Master's of Science in psychology, where one of the projects I really focused on was the psychology of disinformation. So why it works on the brain and what makes us susceptible to people lying to us. And so when a war in the Middle East kicked out with major strategic questions and loads of disinformation, it turns out that I had some stuff to say. At the time, I was lecturing at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. I was a senior lecturer in the academic department there, teaching war studies and also behavioural science. And now I'm a think tank research fellow with the Henry Jackson Society, where my focus is the Middle East as well. So on top of that, over the last year, I've been to Israel 4 times. I've been to Gaza twice with the IDF, and I've been into Lebanon, into a captured Hezbollah tunnel with the IDF. So I've had a pretty good exposure to this war. I've had meetings with the president, the prime minister, the defense minister when it was Mr. Gallant. I spoke to Mr. Katz when he was foreign minister, and I've seen the IDF at every level. So I'm pretty well exposed to this war, and I think I've got a pretty good handle of what's going on and the professional and academic experience to analyze it in depth.
Now, how was this report birthed? Can you give me the moment when you decided, wow, this report needs to be written. We need to research this?
Well, really right from the start of the war, I was looking at the casualty reports that were coming out in the media, being pushed out by the Ministry of Health in Gaza. And it clearly didn't make any sense because, I've called for airstrikes myself. I've seen what airstrikes do to buildings. And the idea that you can have an immediate running ticker counter of deaths when the situation is that violent and that chaotic and that dangerous, frankly, for people to get in there and start counting, just didn't add up to me. And then in conversation with a couple of other researchers, so Salo Eisenberg, Elliot Malin and Dr. Mark Zlochin, the 4 of us have been doing work on this, and we sort of decided to come together around August last year and actually put a paper together on this and try and synthesize all our findings into something people could use. And we were lucky enough to find Tanya Glazer of 50 Global, and she wrote chapter 6, which is the media analysis of just how these casualty reports are having a huge impact on the war worldwide, both in public opinion and policy terms.
Wow, fascinating. Now, onto the report itself, questionable counting. Before we unpack the contents, can you summarize this for us in a sentence or 3? What was your aim and what was the outcome?
So the aim was really to try and examine the reports and see how reliable they were and whether there was any justification to the world's media using them in the way they are. And if they weren't reliable, to try and identify some of the flaws that are obvious when you analyze the numbers in depth, because it's not easy to do, and not everyone on the street has the time or the ability to do this. And so what we tried to do was present this in a way that was really accessible, and that people could use when people throw the casualty stats at you. Hopefully now you've got something in your back pocket to go, actually, that's not true.
Exactly, exactly. Now, you've made a point repeatedly in this report, throughout this report, and you've included it in the title too, to speak about the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza. Why is that? Why make that specification? I mean, an official body such as a ministry, can they not be trusted?
Well, that's the argument a lot of people make, and that's probably one of the first really key findings from the report, is that this idea that Hamas has always been reliable in the past, when actually, if you look in detail, they haven't at all. They've roughly agreed of body count total with the IDF, but what they've consistently done, time and time again in conflicts, is hide the number of combatants. And I'd just draw your attention to Lebanon as a comparator. You know, it's become a famous feature of the Israeli operation in Lebanon that Hezbollah push out these slightly airbrushed photos of their fighters when they're martyred, and, you know, with the green background in uniform looking very noble, and they list people when they die. Hamas are the exact opposite. You haven't seen one single photo like that come out of Gaza since the start of the war. And time again, what Hamas have done is give direction to the people of Gaza, and we've got the proof, we've got the screenshots, telling them not to talk about combatant status when they're talking about people who've died in the war. And the pattern we found is that time and time again, at the end of the war, months after fighting is finished, it eventually emerges that actually loads of these people who died were Hamas fighters and combatants. So we know they're concealing fighter deaths. And of course, there are combatants in this war as well. Hamas are the other side of the fighting equation. And far too often, I think, with the war in Gaza, it's portrayed as if the IDF is just dropping bombs randomly. They're not following a targeting process. They're not aiming at anyone. They're just dropping bombs in to kill people. It's, of course, absolute nonsense. The IDF wouldn't have sustained thousands of casualties and hundreds of dead if they weren't actually fighting anyone. So there are two sides in this war. One's the IDF and the other is Hamas. And therefore, to say that we can take the word of one of the combatants in this conflict as a definitive answer to any question is frankly ridiculous. And yet their platform, time and time again, is the Ministry of Health, failing to mention that they are fully integrated into Hamas's governance system. And we saw that just the other week with the hospital in northern Gaza, where the doctor who became a global superstar turned out to be a full colonel in Hamas itself. You know, this is a deeply unbalanced way to try and report this conflict, to try and maintain that one side is more reliable than the other, when it comes to not having an agenda when they're pushing out figures.
Now, I think what's really concerning about that is the truth does come out, but maybe a few weeks after that, after the fact, and by then you can't unring the bell. It's been rung, correct?
Yeah.
Now, let's move on. What I appreciate from this report, and you've mentioned that, is how user-friendly it is. Anybody can understand it. It starts off by providing 5 key points, 5 takeaways that you've drawn from 40 pages of analysis to follow, and then you unpack each of those key findings in detail, and you mention the evidence to back it up. But can you just briefly mention those 5 key points for us, those 5 key takeaways?
Yeah, of course. The first one is that we found men listed as women. And we've also found women listed as men, in fairness. But the key point that draws out is that the demographic data isn't reliable. So it doesn't matter. We're not really querying the total of dead here. What we're querying is the way that these numbers are broken down within those totals. And if men are listed as women and vice versa, that clearly points to inconsistencies that make them unreliable. The second point is that we found adults listed as children. Quite often, when they don't have an age for a fighter, that goes down as 0. And when that age is 0, of course, they're counted as a child. We also found some really strange, entries, like a 31-year-old being listed as a 4-year-old child. You know, a very difficult mistake to make by accident. And what this, I think, shows us is, once again, those demographics don't quite add up. The really, yeah, sorry, go on.
There. Surely, in the absolute din of war, it's normal to make a mistake or two.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'm not making any conclusions about whether this stuff is deliberate or malign. I think there is circumstantial evidence around it to suggest that it might be malign, but we can also be be fair and say that it is exceptionally difficult to do this. Either
Mhm.
way, it means you can't rely on the figures, whether it's malign or not. The point is that there's enough mistakes in there that you have to be
Ah,
very careful when you're citing this stuff and trying to claim that you've got any sort of conclusive fact in your hand.
I think that's the point that I'm asking. Are we looking at one or two mistakes that's happened like that, or are we looking at quite a number, so many that it raises eyebrows?
And that's a real issue with the report. And I've freely admitted that we've only been able to find a snapshot because we don't have full access to the Palestinian population registry. We don't have the ability to get in there and look at the bodies ourselves. But with the snapshot we found enough just with the open source stuff we've got. I suggest the odds that we've found the only mistakes are pretty slim. I suspect the ones on top of the ones that we found, there will be more as well.
My goodness.
But the more important point, I think, is the way the demographics break down as they're reported. Now, I've already said I don't think they're reliable, but let's take them and pretend they are.
Mhm.
You hear all the time about how women and children are dying disproportionately. Actually, that's not the case, and that's really important. By population percentage, by proportion, fighting age men of 15 and between 15 and 45 years old are overwhelmingly dying the most. Now, often you will find that men die the most in war zones anyway, but if we take that and then combine it with what we know about IDF targeting processes, and I've sat in IDF targeting cells, I've got paperwork that shows the process they follow when they're putting a strike together. When we combine it with that, when we combine it with the IDF's rules of engagements, which last time I saw them were on their 60-second iteration, because the IDF are very keen to get this right. Um,
Mhm.
when we take all that stuff in, that's around it, then we can firmly suggest that this points us towards the fact that Israel is targeting fighting age males, not random civilians, and fighting age males during a combat situation are probably fighters. So that's a really, really important finding. And it's actually was reinforced by the Lancet paper that came out the weekend. Now, they think that Hamas are overcounting. We think they're potentially undercounting. Either way, that means they're unreliable. So they agree that they're unreliable, but they also identify the same trend that we identified of males between the ages of 15 to 45. So even sort of anti-Israel reports are reinforcing this stuff. Yeah, sorry, go for it.
No, no, I'm just, it's exactly the opposite of what is being portrayed in the media.
Yeah,
It's
and it's staggering, isn't it? You know, 26% of men made up Gaza's population.
true.
Yeah, it was total population, 26 of them were adult males. Now, if Israel was targeting indiscriminately, you would expect to see roughly 26% of the dead being adult males there or thereabouts. But actually, it's closer to 44%, over 50% in some places when you take it by proportion. Um, that's before we even get to some of the fatalities of children, which unfortunately we know for a fact that Hamas uses child fighters. So even some of the under 18s will probably have been combatants, illegally so, from Hamas.
Mhm.
You're absolutely not supposed to use child fighters, but we know they do. So the way this has been reported globally, I don't think is a fair reflection of what's actually happening on the ground in Gaza.
Now, how has this report been received? This is absolutely contrary to the mainstream media out there painting Israel as everything that's evil. What was the reaction to this report?
Well, I think when someone releases a report, it usually goes exactly the same way every time, and that is that the people who want to hear it think it's great.
Right.
The people who don't want to hear it call you all kinds of names. And our report absolutely followed that pattern. But we did get great media reception. We've had coverage in over 20 countries. We've had more than 200 million social media impressions across all platforms. I've done on my own, I've done 25 to 30 interviews about it and podcasts, things like that. My co-authors, Tanya Glazer, has managed to get media coverage in Russia. So even as far as abroad as Russia, we've had coverage. And it's actually what's really reassured me is that all the people attacking it haven't really landed a punch. And they can make the exact point that you did, is that we haven't found that many mistakes, which is fine. That's only one part of the report. What they haven't been able to do is really question the fact that actually proportionally men are dying more than any other demographic. They haven't been able to question the way we've reinforced the IDF's findings of 17,000 plus Hamas fighters. They haven't been able to attack the fact that the media coverage is savagely biased. And so the really important stuff in the report, nobody's really come close to. So I'm actually really happy with how it was received and the way the world has approached it. The really sad thing for me is that clearly the main and most biased media outlets haven't really come near it. But that wasn't really our point. Our point was to give people ammunition to fight back.
Correct. This is an absolute tool. This is a tremendous tool to be used. Now, Andrew, I have an absolute burning question, and that is the following. This report, it wasn't just pulled together in an afternoon. It took copious hours of research, extensive analyses, man hours, funds. Why? You are not Israeli, you are not Jewish. Why take this on? Why even invest in this?
I think from the first point is that I'm an analyst and it's my job in some ways to do this stuff because, if I looked at the facts, figures, and everything I know contextually about warfare and academically about warfare, and I came to the conclusion that Israel was committing a genocide, then I would say so. But the fact is they're not. And I think there is a wider battle being fought here in the West, actually. And it's about our values. It's about truth. It's about giving people a fair trial. It's about certainly extremism as well. It's about version of Western societies. And actually everything in the way that Israel's war is being reported on is part of that much bigger fight. And I think it's really important that our media have correct standards, that our media report things fairly, because that affects public opinion, which speaks to the very heart of our democracy and how we make policy decisions at the governmental level. So actually, this is really important, and it's all very easy to say, "Hey, it's Israel's problem." Let Israel fight their own war, but I think it's much bigger than just Israel, and I think it's really important that people kind of fight this subversion of our international narratives, because I have spent the best part of my adult life fighting against Islamic extremism in Afghanistan. And the last thing I think is appropriate is that we allow Islamic extremism to find a foothold in the West and start impacting on the way we do business on a global scale.
Andrew, I've got one final question, and I've never seen combat in my life. The majority of listeners, the majority of viewers, probably not either. And to be honest, the images coming out of Gaza, it is heartbreaking. But I have a theory, and that is that the images that we see is so particularly heartbreaking because we're not exposed to war so face to face this often. Is my theory correct? In your opinion, as a combat veteran, as a military expert, and as an academic, how would you describe the IDF's performance in Gaza, and how would you compare and contrast it to that of Hamas?
I don't think it's unfair to say that the IDF is currently fighting in possibly the most complicated and complex battle space that any army has ever had to fight in. You would have to go back to Stalingrad, I think, to find an environment as difficult to fight in as Gaza is. And that's because of Hamas's tactics. The tunnel network is unprecedented in modern times. It's longer than the London Underground in length of tunnel. This creates an environment where the IDF is having to operate 360 degrees. They're having to go above ground, below ground. They're having to look up, left, right. The buildings are rubble. Incredibly difficult to fight in, and they've got an enemy that's running around, popping up and deliberately trying to put civilians in harm's way. And we see all the time criticism of Israel for strikes in the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. And the reason they're striking in there is because Hamas is hiding amongst civilians, which is clearly a war crime. So on the one side, we have an Israeli force that is having to fight an exceptionally difficult battle, made 10 times more complicated by the fact that their enemy is trying to get civilians killed, take photos of it, and then use it on the world stage to attack them. And they've done that incredibly successfully. I think in terms of the military war, Israel has had a pretty good win, but they need to come to a conclusion where they can seize that win and actually take it and get the hostages home. On the international stage, Israel's had a pretty savage beating, and I think there are some really good lessons about how to fight an information war that come out of this conflict. But you're right, the images are horrific, and this is one of the first wars that's ever really been live streamed. We've not really had any. Ukraine came close, but nothing on these terms. And people are absolutely right to be horrified by the images of war. It is a horrifying thing. But let's not forget why this war started. Let's not forget 7th of October and the horrors that Hamas perpetrated on Israel. And the fact that it is a war that needs to be fought so that can never happen again. Unfortunately, caught in the crossfire are Gaza's poor civilians. And it's absolutely right as well that we have compassion for them and appreciate that every civilian death is a tragedy. But for the overwhelming most part, those civilian deaths are on Hamas's hands rather than the IDF's, from my objective position.
Andrew, Major Fox, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Ladies and gentlemen, questionable counting. Remember to look out for the link in the description below. Thank you for tuning in from Ilse Strauss at Bridges for Peace in Jerusalem. Remember to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Goodbye.